wonderful. So in addition to our special guest with Michelle Duster, I'm so happy and want to thank the many people who made this program possible this evening, including our board, Katrina Huff-Larmond, Barbara Ridge, and Maureen Hanson, our wonderful associate director, as well as several staff folks who have been fantastic: Pat O'Halloran, Cherise Thompson, Kevin Gilnick, and others. And as well, we want to thank Mass Humanities, who helped support this event tonight, and we are so thankful to Mass Humanities for that. I believe that Linda Dorsino-Foray may be on, and she is one of our advisory board members, and we're so thrilled that she is joining us this evening. And Representative Christine Barber of Somerville, thank you so much. Mayor Yvonne Spicer, I know, is hoping to be on this evening as well. Mayor Spicer of Framingham, and other elected officials who I may not know are on. Welcome to all of you, and to many of you who have participated over the years or are new to Suffrage 100 Massachusetts. So with that, the one other thing I wanted to do was give a shout out to Steve Kenny. Now you can't see me, unfortunately, but behind me is what we call a suffrage panel. These are display panels that describe suffragists from throughout Massachusetts and the country, and they are online under resources for Suffrage 100 MA, and they're also linked to the Commonwealth Museum. And Steve Kenny, who is the wonderful director there, has produced these with us, and we were very happy and have been happy to work with him on these. And I want to give a shout out to Kathy Friedberg, who has helped us with these as well. And the one sitting behind me is of Ida B. Wells, and my thanks as well to Michelle Duster, who helped us with that one. So the other thing I was going to say is we are going to have Q&A for the last 15 minutes of the program. There is a Q&A button that I hope you can see on your screen, and feel free to go ahead and type in your questions for that. So with that, I want to introduce Katrina Huff-Larmond, who is Vice President of Suffrage 100 Massachusetts and a Delta Theta alum. And also she is town councilor in Randolph since first being elected in 2016. And we know that for her and Christine Barbers and others, this is a very busy time. It's election season, and Mayor Spicer. So really appreciate all the time that you are able to give us. Katrina is a professor and clinical social worker. She has over 15 years experience in the diversity and inclusion field and is a leading diversity and inclusion expert in the greater Boston area, and prides herself on embracing social work to create social change. She's involved in many organizations. She's a Delta, as I said, and a member of the Massachusetts Women of Color Coalition, and many more. Not to mention the time she spends with her wonderful husband and teenage son. And I just have to say that Katrina and I met a few years ago when we were on a trip together, actually in Israel, with the Jewish Community Relations Council. And I remember one of the first things that Katrina mentioned was that she was a Delta, and I was so excited because I'd been learning all about the Deltas, frankly, from the 1913 parade, and I was so excited to meet a Delta. So Katrina is, we're so happy that you can be with us this evening and talk with us about the Deltas.
Hello, hello. Thank you, Freddie. I appreciate that. I think I'm also having camera issues. I just wanted to put that out there. I don't know if there's more that you want me to do. Freddie, could you hear me?
I can. So I think hopefully this will work with the others, but it appears you and I have to go without being live video, but people can hear us.
Okay. Okay. Well, hello. I'm really sorry that you're unable to see me. Especially, I'm a person with expression, and so I like to. You see my face, you see my hands, and I like to tell a story. But it's okay. We can definitely go forward because Ida B. Wells is much more than just seeing us as the video. We could tell the Ida B. Wells story, and we could appreciate the Ida B. Wells story, even when we have difficulties, because this is what we move through. We continue to do the work as we work through our difficulties. And that's what Ida B. Wells is all about, working through the difficulties, even when things were not in her favor. So I'm appreciative that I'm here and able to speak with you in the community. Ida B. Wells is an icon in the Black community and a hero to many. She has demonstrated her activism in areas that have changed society. And should I say, that has changed the world. We know her as an anti-lynching and a suffrage activist. As an activist, Ida B. Wells was always bold and remarkable. For instance, when Ida B. Wells was expected to walk in back of the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., she felt like that wasn't good enough to get the message across, to really represent what suffrage is all about. So she decided she was going to walk with her Illinois delegates, knowing how dangerous that would be, and knowing how others will look at her walking with white women and white men. She knew this would not be the popular thing to do, but she still put herself in a situation where it was dangerous. Look at that. I just got really excited, people. So hello, Katrina Huff-Larmond. But to continue on, she continued to put herself in a situation where it was part of her making a difference, part of human rights. So she knew she had to do that. And then the other piece I wanted to just mention to individuals, because 1913 was a very active and special year, especially for the suffrage movement. There was an organization called Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, who also marched in the suffrage movement, knowing also that that would not be the most popular practice to make, but also knew that it was important to support the suffrage movement and to support human rights. So Delta Sigma Theta was founded in 1913 as well, and the suffrage parade was their first social action activity, where they successfully were able to march and knew that they must at least be part of such an important activity. So I want to thank Michelle for being here and sharing this story of Ida B. Wells with us. We are pleased and we are honored that you are here to be with us, to share this very special, we believe that is a very special story, you being the great-granddaughter, and we appreciate you, and thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, let's see. Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. Thank you very much, Katrina. So I am very pleased and honored to introduce Michelle Duster and also Charlotte Golar Richie, who are going to have a conversation in just a moment. So Michelle Duster is an author, professor, public historian, and champion of racial and gender equity. She has written, edited, or contributed to over a dozen books. Her most recent, Ida B. Well, the Queen, which I have to quickly show up with all my stickies, from reading the book. The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells was released on January 26, 2020 of this year by Atria One Signal Publishers, which is a division of Simon & Schuster. She co-wrote the popular children's history book, Tate and His Historic Dream, co-edited Impact, Personal Portraits of Activism, Shifts, an anthology of women's growth through change, Michelle Obama's Impact on African-American women and girls, and edited 2 books that include the writings of her paternal great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. She has written articles for Time, Essence, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, People, Glamour, Daily Beast, and the North Star. She has appeared on MSNBC, CNN, WGTW, CBS, and CW, as well as numerous radio shows. Her advocacy has led to street names, monuments, historical markers, murals, and other public history projects that highlight women and African Americans, including Ida B. Wells. She is working on 2 children's picture books, and I believe that one of them may be coming out in January, and several public history projects that will feature women trailblazers. And I hope that Michelle will tell us about some of the things going on in Chicago and elsewhere that she's been working on. And I have to add that I had the extreme pleasure and honor of meeting Michelle January 2020 in Pasadena, California, when we were both in the Rose Bowl. Thank you, Maureen. That is a picture of the float to commemorate the 19th Amendment, and it's called Years of Hope, Years of Courage. And you can see this wonderful passing the torch, these signs that were up there. All of this is made with flowers only. Everything has to be flower made. And I think it took them, they needed to raise about $300,000 for this incredible float. In the middle, right near the Statue of Liberty, you can see a group of people in white waving. One of them is Michelle. And she was among the descendants who were on this incredible float. And behind the float, you see many women in white, and I'm in that crowd representing the state of Massachusetts. Was a great honor. We needed to be there a few days before and so forth. So in that time, I did have the honor and pleasure of getting to meet Michelle, which is how I was able to contact her to work on the panel behind me, which you can now see, this suffrage panel, which we so appreciate. And again, so honored that she is with us this evening. Now, before I turn it over to Michelle, I want to introduce a dear friend, and I think I can say colleague, who's a wonderful person I've known for many years and admired from afar, and then luckily got to know her. Charlotte Golar Richie has a background in public service and political activism, and a deeply held commitment to civil rights, racial equity, and women's political leadership. She has spent 25 years in government as a former state legislator, civil rights commissioner, housing chief, and neighborhood development director. Since her groundbreaking campaign in 2013 as the first African-American woman to run for mayor of Boston, Charlotte has dedicated her time to board and philanthropic activities and uplifting the leadership efforts of women and people of color. She and her husband, Winston, are former Peace Corps volunteers and proud parents of adult daughters, Lee and Kara, who are working to affect positive change in their own communities. It is my great honor and pleasure to turn it over to Charlotte Golar Richie for a conversation with Michelle Duster.
Thanks so much, Fredie, and thanks, Katrina, and welcome, Michelle Duster, and welcome to everyone who's joined us this evening. I'm really happy to be here. I was prepared, Fredie, to make this like a really great podcast, okay? We were gonna adjust, but I'm happy now that we get to see each other. I wanna congratulate you, Michelle, for the publication of your new book, Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells. I've been reading your book with great interest, and there were several fascinating actions that your great-grandmother took to address systemic racism and sexism in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it's my hope that after this conversation, we'll have a better understanding of the pioneering work of your great-grandmother. So let me start from in terms of the origin of the book and just ask you, since you've written a couple of books at least about Ida B. Wells, why this book now?
Well, first, I just want to thank everybody for having me as part of this discussion. It is definitely an honor. And I really enjoyed meeting Fredie back in 2020 in January, right before, I mean, it's just amazing. We're all going to have this pre and post pandemic, markers in our lives. And so it was just a couple of months before everything shut down. So it was just an amazing honor to be part of that parade. I was representing my great-grandmother in her honor, and for her to get that kind of recognition 100 years after the 19th Amendment was passed really did mean a lot, because we all know, or maybe most of us know, that there was some tension and some division during the suffrage movement. And so for there to be an effort today, in today's world, for there to be some reconciliation and recognition of the fact that everything was not, a fairy tale during those days. So anyway, I just wanted to thank everybody for having me. I did write this book, Ida B. the Queen, which was published in January of 2021. So just about a year after the Rose Bowl Parade that recognized the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And I wrote this book because it was just obvious to me after a while that there's another generation, the younger generation, that is not as familiar with my great-grandmother and her legacy as maybe some people my age and up. And here in Chicago, where I'm born and raised in Chicago, which is where my great-grandmother lived the last half of her life, and subsequent generations after that. So I'm the fourth generation, if you count my great-grandmother, the fourth generation Chicagoan. And in Chicago, there was a significant housing community, a public housing community named after her that opened in 1941, which was 10 years after she died. And so in Chicago, her name was well known, but it was starting to be more associated with the housing community than her as a woman. And the housing community started to be torn down in 2002. And so I feared that with the demise of the housing community, then her name would start to be forgotten completely. And so I wanted to create work. I started with two other books that included her original writings, but then I created this book, which is more of a biography that not only tells her story, but connects her story and her legacy to current people and current movements and activities, so that younger people could see that what's happening today didn't just happen now. It's connected to what happened before, and to make it accessible and relatable to a younger generation.
Let's touch on some of those activities. Because you definitely cover a lot of territory with your book, Michelle, and we learn a great deal. So we go beyond, we understand now, as Katrina mentioned, the work that she did as an anti-lynching crusader and a champion for women gaining the right to vote, but there were so many other things that she did. I mean, she was a college graduate, a teacher who later established the first kindergarten in Chicago for Black children. And you educate us on the fact that she was an investigative reporter and a pioneer of what's called out there data journalism. And she was also a newspaper owner. Add to all of that, she worked in the criminal justice system as Chicago's first female probation officer. And then, of course, we learn later that she challenged the same system on more than one occasion. And she was the founder, co-founder of numerous organizations, including the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, the National Association of Colored Women's Club, and the NAACP, our country's oldest and largest civil rights organization. And the year before she passed away, she ran for the Illinois State Senate. So we could take like an hour talking about any one of those activities.
Exactly.
If we look at page 38, and I did read your book, I really loved your book. The pictures, the photographs of your family members, the artwork, but your storytelling is, for me, it was captivating. And I think for all ages. On page 38 of your book, we meet Ida B. Wells in 1883 at age 21, when she filed what would be known today as a public accommodations discrimination complaint. And this was decades before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. So I want to ask you, what were the circumstances that motivated Ida to file that lawsuit?
Well, I mean, after Reconstruction ended, so for those who are not familiar with this, I put a timeline, a 400-year timeline in the book to help people understand that my great-grandmother Ida B. Wells did not appear out of nowhere. I think it's important to contextualize her story. And I mean, so she was born in 1862, and she was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And fortunately for her, in 1865, slavery ended. So she had very few memories of being enslaved. And so she grew up during Reconstruction, which was a period of our country's history, a very short period of our country's history, only 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, where formerly enslaved people had gained enormous amount of rights. And so she grew up during a period of time, a window of time where African-American men gained the right to vote. And she grew up with her father, who was politically engaged and very much a leader in the community. And he happened to own property, and he was a carpenter. Her mother was a cook. And so she grew up in a kind of slightly unique way compared to the majority of people who have been formerly enslaved. And so I feel that her childhood and the environment that she grew up in is what contributed to her deciding to stand up for her rights when it came to public accommodations, because there was a window of time when she had that right to ride on the train in Tennessee. She eventually had moved to Tennessee, and the state of Tennessee, after Reconstruction ended in 1877, then the country kind of went to states' rights, where before that, there was what I'm sure some people in the South consider to be occupation by Northern troops that were insisting on sort of equality. And in 1877, there was this backlash in this removal of the troops. And so then the states could implement their individual laws. So the state of Tennessee in 1881 implemented a law that separated public accommodations based on race. But my great-grandmother had been riding that train for several years, commuting between Memphis and Woodstock, Tennessee, in order to work. So I try to put myself in that position of, and I think we can kind of see it now, right? Where people have certain rights, and then all of a sudden the rights are chipped away and turned and eliminated. And so then people react of like, how can you have this right yesterday but not today? So she sued on the basis of the railroad being separate and unequal, because the law said that there could be separate and equal, and they were absolutely not equal. The ladies' car and the colored car were not equal.
Now kind of grabs her, and it becomes kind of physical, and to basically get her to move to the back of the train. And here she is, a 21-year-old, still developing and all of that, and has a job out of town and has to confront this with people on the train, as you were describing, kind of seeing this as got a front row seat at the movie, watching this situation unfold. And I wonder with her, how she was not devastated and did not retreat, but instead was emboldened to say, I am going to file a lawsuit, and in fact prevailed with that lawsuit, didn't she?
Right, she filed a lawsuit on the basis of the fact that the train, the ladies' car and the colored car were separate and unequal. The ladies' car was what she considered to be nice and comfortable. And I have to, I think about the fact that she was sold the ticket. So why would they sell her a ticket to the ladies' coach and then say she can't ride on it? But the colored car had men on it, and white men were free to go to that car and smoke and drink. The trains were, the way they were designed was that the colored car was in the front of the train. And if you look at old pictures of trains at that point, the smoke from the engine of the train was in the front. And so when it was going, the smoke from the actual train would fly into the colored car also. And so my great-grandmother had a real problem with, I guess she really was anti-smoking because that's one of the things that she, really talked about, was the smoke was so offensive, as well as just the environment being what she considered to be uncomfortable. And so that was the basis that she sued, and she was victorious at first because the Shelby County court found that it was separate and unequal. But then the train company, the Chesapeake, Ohio and Southwestern Train Company, decided to appeal the case, and it was appealed several times, all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court in 1887. So that was 2.5 years later. The ruling was overturned, and the train company claims that everything was fine, it was all equal, and that my great-grandmother was harassing the train company, because she actually filed complaints twice, once in 1883 and once in 1884. So I guess they considered that to be harassment.
Oh, okay, we'll move on from this, but for me, it struck me as a very strong example of Ida's courage and conviction. And we do see that at a very early age, your great-grandmother, she wasn't backing down. Okay, so she had a very strong personality, but she was also a person of faith, wasn't she? And she was a family person, a wife, a mother, and also a caring, compassionate sibling who looked after her brothers and sisters after her parents died unexpectedly from yellow fever. There was an epidemic, as you describe in the book. There's a beautiful photograph in there of you and your grandmother, Alfreda Duster, who was Ida's youngest child.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what Alfreda told you about, her mother, Ida, who was born into slavery, 1862. And did Alfreda talk about Ida's parents and what they had to endure as enslaved people?
No, she really didn't talk in as great a detail as I think people assume. To me, my grandmother was a grandmother. She first of all, was one of 15 grandchildren. So I was one of many grandchildren that she had. And I didn't really, I spent time with her because we used to go to the Y. My father and my two brothers and my grandmother and I used to go to the Y every Saturday and go swimming. My grandmother was a very avid swimmer. And we were just playing around, splashing around, playing in the pool. But I really think what happened was that my father knew that I was too young to go to the locker room by myself. So he probably talked to his mother and said, well, can you come? So I would spend every single Saturday with my grandmother swimming at the pool. And, so that was just fun. It was social. She wasn't lecturing me about her mother, but what she would talk about was more, I think, values of, make sure that you get your education, because your education is something that nobody can take away from you. And when I think back on that, and I learned more about my great grandmother's life, I think I've surmised that my grandmother had that strong value system based on the fact that her mother lost quite a bit. She lost her job as a teacher when she decided to speak up against the segregation in the school systems in Memphis. She received death threats, and she lost her printing press when she spoke out about 3 of her friends who were killed, as basically because they were successful while Black. They owned a grocery store that rivaled a white-owned grocery store, and they were killed in order to eliminate the competition. So there were time and time again in my great grandmother's life that she lost physical possessions or her business, and so this is just my sort of putting the pieces together. I think my grandmother, Ida's daughter, was like, you can't define yourself by your material possessions, and you can't give people a reason to eliminate you because you're not qualified. It has to be because of racism that you are not considered for something, because you are going to be qualified for whatever you decide to go after. In my family, the idea that education is power was definitely a value that was passed down.
So your great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, got married in 1895 to your great-grandfather, Ferdinand L. Barnett, who was a prominent attorney in the city of Chicago. And together they had a family, 4 children, was it, that they had? And Ida's activism continued. So marriage did not prevent her from doing her thing. In fact, she kind of partnered with your great-grandfather in establishing this Negro Fellowship League, which was kind of what we would call in some parts of Boston or Massachusetts, settlement house in a way, right? Where people could come, Southern Blacks migrating to the North could come for information and help in getting acclimated. Is that the case? I don't know if you would tell us about her campaign, their campaign. You mentioned issues with the South. She moves up from the South, but she doesn't forget the South. And she does not forget her connections there and her friends there and the atrocities that she was made aware of. And I wonder if you could just share with us what she did with her campaign that was aided by buttons, publicize, raise awareness about what was going on.
Right, there was an incident that my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, really, what I found particularly intriguing. And in fact, I decided to start my book, Ida B. the Queen, with that particular incident, it's very small. In her autobiography, she kind of, sort of glosses over it. But I decided, wait a minute, wait, backtrack. Let me see like what really happened here. So what happened, and I found particularly interesting and, amazing and fascinating, was that in 1917, during World War I, there was, so the Army was the only branch of the government, of the armed services, that African Americans could be part of, and the Army was segregated, and there was a unit of Black soldiers that were sent to a Camp Logan, which was right outside of Houston, and they ran into a lot of resentment and hostility in the city of Houston, and even within the Army ranks. And so one thing led to another, and they were just kind of antagonized, and they decided to defend themselves. And some people died in what's now called the Houston Riot of 1917. And only the African American soldiers were brought to trial and ultimately executed for what was considered sort of insurrection. And my great-grandmother had a real problem with the United States government executing its own soldiers, especially when they were the ones who were defending themselves. And the rest of them, there were several dozen, were sent to prison. So my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, decided to start a campaign. Well, she wanted to honor the soldiers who had been killed, but also have sort of a silent protest against the United States government for executing its own soldiers, its own citizens that are being sent. They were sent there in order to train so that they could go overseas to fight for freedom and democracy. But they couldn't get freedom and democracy in their own country. And so she created some buttons that said "Martyred Negro Soldiers." And she wanted to have a memorial service in Chicago, but couldn't find any church that was willing to host it. So she decided to just hand out the buttons. And she was visited by FBI agents at the Negro Fellowship League who were questioning her patriotism as a result of her criticizing the government. And they threatened her with being imprisoned because she was criticizing the government. And so this one, I mean, it's about 2 pages in her book, but I decided to learn more about what happened at Camp Logan and, you know, the Army and everything else that was around that, because it was just amazing to me that she was so adamant about how this country treated Black people. And in that particular situation, we're talking about Black people who are defending this country, who are fighting on behalf of the country, wearing the uniform, military uniform of this country, and still could not get justice, or still could not be treated with dignity and respect and even fairness within the judicial system.
The remaining few minutes we have together, I think we should move over to women's suffrage. And last year, as you know, many of us here in Massachusetts marked the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which made it legal for women to vote. We also learned that it took another 45 years for Black women, women of color, to be guaranteed that right. How did Ida B. Wells become such an advocate for voting rights for women? And do tell us, from your perspective, your research, what went on that day, March 3rd, 1913.
Well, a lot of people today might not know that women gained the right to vote in this country initially state by state. The same way, you know, that in today's world there has been equal marriage, or that went state by state, and then like cannabis laws becoming legal state by state. And so the same thing happened 100 years ago when it came to women's right to vote. And in Illinois, women gained the right to vote in 1913. So it was 7 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. And so it's an extension of for her, the fighting for women to have the right to vote was an extension of civil rights and women's movement, women's clubs, because there were women's clubs, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who was in Boston, had founded the Women's Era Club. I think it was in 1893. And Ida was, she entered, I think that's when they actually first met, was in 1893, after Ida B. Wells came back from England. She went to England in 1893 and then again in 1894. And while she was in England, she watched how the British women had formed these women's clubs and was intrigued by that. And when she came back to this country, there was an effort on her part to start that, have women organize, because they did not have the right to vote. And so, through these women's clubs, there was a way to collectively engage in activism and put pressure on political leaders. And so it was a process of advocating for women to be involved with having some influence over political figures, to actually having the right to vote themselves. You're on mute.
Sorry. For our audience who may be hearing this name, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, for the first time, she was, like Ida B. Wells, an activist, a staunch supporter of women having the right to vote. And in Massachusetts, she was able to vote as many as 41 times before the 19th Amendment was passed and ratified. And so that was under a special, what they called a school suffrage law. So I'm happy to know that they met, because I didn't see that. I don't know that I knew that. And
right.
and
Not only did they meet for the in 1893, but they were both founders, co-founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was one of the people who spearheaded the idea of having. There were different women's clubs around the country. And in 1896, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin is one of the people who spearheaded the idea for all the different clubs around the country to unite and have a national Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And so Ida B. Wells and Josephine interacted quite a few times, actually, even in New York, when Ida started doing speaking after she was exiled from the South. She lived in New York City, Brooklyn specifically, for about a year in 1892. And Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was in New York. And she provided quite a bit of support for Ida. And last thing, as far as this march that happened in Washington, D.C. in 1913, only a couple of months after my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was an all-Black suffrage club in Chicago. And she was really interested in having Black women, collectively engage in politics. And so the first thing she did as the president of the suffrage club was to go to Washington, D.C. and march in this parade with the Illinois delegation. The founders of Delta Sigma Theta were also in that march. And some people think they marched together, which is not what happened. My great-grandmother actually ended up marching with the Illinois delegation, defying the request for Black women to march in the back of the parade. So she was with her Illinois delegation. And then I know the Deltas also marched in that same parade.
Fascinating. I want to bring in my colleague, because we're sort of at time for this segment, and there's so many other questions that I could definitely ask you. And I'm happy in the book, you touch on, if we were to fast forward to issues of today, you touch on those issues of today in your book. And we, of course, we're all aware of the racial awakening that took place last year, and the spotlight that was placed on disparities, health and economic disparities, systemic racism and sexism, and the things that your great-grandmother was fighting against all these years, many years ago. So I think we'll probably be able to get into some of that in this next segment. So now I have the pleasure of bringing up my colleague. And I do that as I also thank you, Michelle Duster, for being with us. Really, I love talking to you and hearing these stories. And like I said, I wish we could spend so much more time listening to these stories. But as we wrap up, I just want to make sure the audience knows Michelle's book. It is Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells. It's a book that I've enjoyed. It's I could recommend it. And I think that it's great to share with the entire family. Lori is with us, Lori Cawthorne. And Lori, I want to introduce her and then pass the mic to her. She's the president of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Norfolk and Plymouth Alumnae chapter. She's also associate director of HR and diversity, inclusion, belonging at anti-racism, and Title IX resource coordinator for the Harvard Library. Lori represents the library nationally on the Association of College and Research Libraries Diversity Alliance Task Force. And in her spare time, she's a consultant with Theta Jones and Associates and a long-term appointed member of the Town of Brookline, Massachusetts Human Resources Board. So Lori has been tracking audience questions during this conversation, questions that appeared in the chat, and she will now have the pleasure of continuing this wonderful conversation with Michelle Duster, great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. Lori, you're on.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Michelle. So the audience has been a little shy, so I do have a question to start us off, and I'm going to ask the audience, as I ask the question, please don't be shy. Please put your questions in the chat so Michelle can answer. So just to start us off, thinking about today. So last year's racial awakening kind of provoked a lot of conversations about health and economic disparities that we witnessed with COVID, as well as our country's long history of systemic and structural racism and sexism that impacted our country. Do you see similarities with your great-grandmother's courage and the courage exhibited by activists of today?
Well, yes, I mean, that was one of the things I tried my best to include in Ida B. the Queen, was the sort of parallels that I see between the time, during my great grandmother's lifetime and now. There were several things that that kind of struck me as just very similar. One thing is Woodrow Wilson, the president the person who was president during World War I, and he's the person that the suffrage march took place right before his inauguration in 1913. He had some similar traits and some similar ideas as the person who was our previous president, number 45. And so the sort of rolling back of rights, the sort of dismantling of certain programs during Woodrow Wilson's administration. I mean, he was resegregating the federal government, and my great grandmother had a problem with that, and she actually went to visit him, and along with William Monroe Trotter, to basically protest against the resegregation of the federal government. And he also, I mean, Birth of a Nation, which was one of the most now infamous films ever made, that was also actually used as a recruiting tool for the Klan, that perpetuated these stereotypes about who African Americans are in order to justify violence and oppression against our communities. That movie was screened in the White House, in Woodrow Wilson's White House. So while I was writing this book, the 45th president of our country was in office. And so I found there to be quite a few similarities. And then, of course, the people during our time who are resisting this sort of dismantling of progress, definitely were using some of the same tools and the same strategies that my great grandmother was using, which was, taking control of our narrative, telling our own stories and our perspectives. We have different tools now and different technology than she had, but it's the same sort of resistance, and protesting alone, taking a stand, sometimes at your own hardship, which is something that to the most current person that I included was Colin Kaepernick. who clearly has taken a stand and suffered his career, but I think ultimately he's going to be bigger than football. And you know, and then so when it comes to taking control of our narrative, I mean, I talked about John H. Johnson, you know, starting the Johnson Publishing Company in order to have our voice, our perspectives, our stories told. And so there are numerous ways that people are involved in our own form of resistance. It's not everybody's just out in the streets with, you know, chanting and having signs. There are different ways that people can be engaged in affecting change.
Thank you. And a question from the audience. It's amazing that Ida B. Wells single-handedly led the anti-lynching campaigns. I have not read any of the persons who accompanied her on these campaigns. Who were some of her other supporters?
Well, William Monroe Trotter, who I think is appreciated, but he was actually located in Boston. So hopefully in Boston, he gets more name recognition than maybe some other parts of the country. But he was a really big advocate. They really, my great-grandmother Ida B. Wells and William Monroe Trotter were very like-minded. They were both considered to be radical, militant, unreasonable people. But they were had very strong convictions, and he was also the editor of a newspaper, so they had a lot in common. Also, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois was one of her contemporaries, and they both were co-founders of the NAACP together. They had, you know, some other things in common as far as them both being writers. They had different histories, which made them have slightly different ways of thinking about the world or approaching the world, but they definitely, you know, interacted quite a bit. And also Marcus Garvey. I mean, there's several people that I actually included in the book Ida B. the Queen to show how she definitely interacted with some of her contemporaries, as well as some people who were not in the same generation. For instance, Frederick Douglass served as her mentor later on in his, well, for a couple of years before he passed away. He was about 45 years older than her, so one would not just necessarily consider them necessarily contemporaries, but he was very encouraging of her and provided opportunities. That's the reason why she actually came to Chicago initially, was at Frederick Douglass's request to work with him to create a pamphlet that chronicled the realities of African Americans in this country to be distributed so the world would know what the situation really was in this country. And I could just go on and on with different names of people that she interacted with, but there was quite a few. But as far as specifically when it comes to the anti-lynching, I would say that William Monroe Trotter was probably the most active when it came to, you know, interacting with her in that way. And Du Bois, when he became the editor of the Crisis magazine, which was the magazine for the NAACP, that the organization itself sort of took on the anti-lynching.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. As I've been doing my own reading and research on Miss Ida, I often wonder what her relationship with white women suffragists was like. The divide between being a woman, being a Black woman, and being a white woman, there were definite struggles there. Do you have any ideas on what some of the obstacles might have been?
When I was researching, you know, to write Ida B. the Queen, I tried, you know, to find as many details as I could about her experiences. And, you know, like I said, I mean, some things differed depending on what state people were in. And she was in Illinois starting in 1895. And so according to her writings, she had a fairly congenial kind of relationship with the white women suffragists in Illinois. She also interacted with Susan B. Anthony, and they had some differences when it came to their focus on what the goal was when it came to women gaining the right to vote. because, and this was a sort of divide among Black and white women in general, was that Susan B. Anthony, and Ida talks about this in her autobiography, that Susan B. Anthony believed that when women gained the right to vote, that the political environment would become more more sensitive because women are involved, and women needed to have the same rights as men. Ida felt, and I think a lot of other Black women felt, that Black women needed to gain the right to vote in order to combat racism and combat economic oppression and inequality when it came to housing and education and other issues and other realities that were a little bit more specific to being Black. And also, you know, there were some, even within white women's suffrage organizations, there was not unilateral kind of way of thinking, because there was some classism, you know, going on even within white women. So the whole story is more messy than I think we tend to give it, you know, when we tend to think about it. It's just not so simple of Black and white, because, like I said, in Illinois, my great-grandmother worked with two different organizations, suffrage organizations, that were predominantly white. And she decided that she wanted to create the Alpha Suffrage Club as an all-Black organization in order to mobilize Black women kind of separate from white women, not because she had a problem with white women in Illinois, but because she felt that the Black women needed their own when it came to having their voice within on a more local level, specifically in Chicago, their wards within the city. And so she felt that if Black women could gain the right to vote, then we could have political power on a local level.
Thank you, Michelle, for your questions, for your answers. Thank you, audience, for your questions. Looking at the time, I will turn it back over to Fredie to close this out.
There we go. Is this gonna work? There we go. Hi, sorry. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, did that hour fly by? I really want to thank you, of course, Michelle. That was amazing. To Charlotte and Lori, thank you so much for your questions. And I think we all feel like we could talk about this for a very long time and be on a conversation for hours, because there is so much. I'm reminded that when we started back in 2010, just in these past 11 years, the number of books and research that's been happening, I think, has been spectacular. And if nothing else, it's fabulous that that is happening. And we are the beneficiaries of that great work, such as yours, and so appreciate your having written this book and look forward to your children's book. Am I right? There's a children's book coming out?
Yeah, children's picture book for the little ones, the 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds.
We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone after this and include a link of the recording. But I also want to give you an opportunity, Michelle, at that time, maybe, if you have suggestions for us or links to your website for more information, for more things you would recommend. As I'm remembering this monument that just came up in Chicago that you worked so long on for Ida B. Wells. It's in Chicago. Many of us have chatted about our children and relatives and friends in Chicago, so we all want to come visit you in Chicago and see your memorial and see you and all these things there. I do want to give a shout out. There are people on this Zoom from California who are very happy that we mentioned the parade. So hello to California, Martha Wheelock and others. Thank you for joining us. There are so many thank yous to include. I want to mention Frugal Books, which is on our invitation, and Nubian Square, and they are carrying the book, and you can order the book through them, which is great. They're terrific. It was wonderful to meet Clarissa and Leonard Egerton, who run this fantastic bookstore. I also have 2 quick events to squeeze in to mention. Starting this evening at 6:30, the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, which is one of our Suffrage 100 Massachusetts partners from early on, is doing a wonderful event tonight on the legacy of Pauline Agassiz Shaw, who lived from 1841 to 1917. She was a very wealthy woman, I think, but worked very hard for institutionalizing kindergarten, it sounds like Ida B, in Boston public schools. And one of her principles was that there be no racial distinctions. And that was really important to her. And I think it will be fascinating to learn more about that. And she was a suffragist and president of the Boston Equal Suffrage Association for Good Government. So that's coming on. I think you can go on the Facebook page of Boston Women's Heritage Trail. And also, I just want to mention, We Did It For You, this fantastic, it's called We Did It For You, Women's Journey Through History. Many of us have enjoyed their performances, and I'm very pleased to share that they have now recorded a performance, and they are sharing that as well in events. So please check out their website for screening times for that. So with that, I do want to thank everyone again. And Michelle, thank you for joining us from Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and it's fabulous to see you again. And thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. Thank you and take care. Bye, everyone.